Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for this roundtable discussion with national mental health experts to discuss structural racism, generational trauma, and a mental health crisis in communities of color. My name is Dr. Frederick Kowal, and I am president of United University Professions, representing faculty and professional staff at SUNY state-operated campuses, public teaching hospitals, and system administration. UUP has a long tradition of standing strong for civil rights, individual liberties, and the work of justice that the labor movement must, by definition, be a part of. When the brutal terrorist attack happened on the east side here in Buffalo on May 14th, I insisted that our union's response to that horror could not be a one-off reaction or event, but instead, we must stop, listen, and work toward the necessary structural change. We must be committed to the long-run healing of the East Side community in Buffalo, healing that has been needed for decades, well before May 14th. We began this work through conversations with members of the Buffalo community. We reached out to learn more about the issues and the history of the East Side and to amplify the voices of those who have been committed in word and deed to liberating their community and its members from the generations of racist violence that are so endemic in our society. I mostly listened and learned as several of these community members participated in one of the first episodes of our UUP podcast. From these conversations, I knew that the role UUP must take is to be present and take actions that will address the longstanding issues that the Black community faces. At the same time, UUP also began to learn through our work with the Kennedy Forum about the impact that both direct and indirect racism has on the mental and emotional well-being of individuals and entire communities. Communities that experience trauma are left to carry the weight of the initial trauma along with long-term intergenerational trauma, as the equitable and accessible resources to support the impact of racism on mental health are inadequate. From that, we began to plan this panel discussion. Today, we have brought together experts to discuss the negative effect that direct and indirect racism has on mental health care, the central issues of access to care, the inequitable treatment within the healthcare system for people who have access, and the ongoing biases that are perpetuated within mental health models. UUP is engaged in this conversation with the intent of making mental health equity a major priority for our union, for SUNY, and the state of New York. As I have stated many times, though our union has constantly stood for the causes of social justice, what we need is for SUNY to be at the cutting edge of creating the changes necessary to bring about a more just New York. SUNY is uniquely positioned to do so. All that is lacking is the will. While we are in the early stages of developing proposals, and today's conversation will help solidify these initial ideas, UUP is researching various legislative proposals through which SUNY can become a national leader in providing culturally competent mental health care services in our communities and on our campuses, where we know they are desperately needed. And while we are excited that Governor Hochul recently announced that $4 million in federal funding will be used to provide tuition assistance, paid internships, and direct stipends for minority and multilingual students, that must be just the start. UUP will push for the development of a state program that provides broader support for students from underrepresented and under-resourced communities who are pursuing training to become mental health professionals. This program will provide the financial, educational, and mentoring support that will result in more diverse cohorts of students studying to be mental health care professionals, and at the same time, while they complete their degrees, they then can begin to care for patients in our communities. This will serve to also grow our university, the work of our union, and the opportunities for care on our campuses for students and labor alike, as well as the communities in which we live. I am so honored to be monitoring this conversation today. The work of liberation and justice awaits. Let us begin. As we gather to discuss the mental health crisis gripping our communities, it is important that we begin the day and be welcomed by someone who can speak directly to the importance of this collective work. As Mayor of Buffalo, Byron Brown sees how the failures of mental health care play out in our public schools, on our streets, in crimes we can prevent, and in higher education where we can foster a better future. Mayor Brown is a graduate of Buffalo State. Like so many SUNY graduates, he wasn't born and raised here, but this is where he set down roots and charted the path of his career. After graduating from high school in Queens, he made his way to Buffalo, earned a degree in political science and journalism. He would work behind the scenes in local and state government here in Erie County until he was elected to serve on the Buffalo Common Council beginning in 1996. In 2000, he successfully ran for the state Senate, becoming New York State's first African-American state senator elected outside of New York City. 5 years later, Mayor Brown was elected Buffalo's 62nd mayor, taking office in January of 2006. Since that time, he has worked tirelessly for the neighborhoods across the city of Buffalo. He has been a friend to the thousands of UUP members who call Buffalo home, and he has been an advocate for SUNY campuses. He has also been an example of public service to the tens of thousands of young men and women who attend UB, Buffalo State, Fredonia, and other SUNY institutions in Western New York. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome Mayor Byron Brown.
Thank you very much, Fred Kowal. Thank you for that warm and wonderful introduction, and thank you for your leadership as president of UUP and your leadership in this important discussion. I also want to mention that I am a proud member of UUP as a professor of practice here at Buffalo State College, so it is doubly an honor to welcome you today and to welcome this National Mental Health Roundtable on the challenges of the mental health system, including the harmful impact of racism on mental health. I want to thank all of the members of UUP, Governor Kathy Hochul, the state of New York, and all of the faculty and professional staff members employed here at the State University of New York, all of you who are here today for your continued commitment to our shared goal of making mental health equity a priority. I also want to recognize the president of this institution, Dr. Catherine Conway Turner, and Buffalo State for being the host location for this important discussion. And I want to recognize Dr. Fred Floss and thank him for his leadership of UUP here at Buffalo State's campus. Let's give Dr. Floss a round of applause. Buffalo, our state and nation, is at a pivotal moment where we must do the work necessary to rebuild even stronger. That is particularly our mandate here in the city of Buffalo. Our community has had much to grapple with this past year, events that can impact our mental health. As you know, on May 14th of this year, the Buffalo community experienced one of the most painful events in its history when a racist, hate-filled individual invaded our city and took the lives of 10 innocent community members and wounded 3 others. A person whose expressed intent was to kill as many Black people as possible changed our lives forever. Our community was deeply affected by this event. This horrific tragedy highlighted many issues that have impacted our community and Black and brown communities nationwide. Across our country, we have seen over a century of underfunding by the federal government in Black and brown neighborhoods. This has led to unacceptable increases in gun violence, segregation, crime, poor health outcomes, and generational poverty. These factors made Buffalo a target for the May 14th shooter. This act of domestic terrorism, fueled by racism and white supremacy, had a significant mental health and economic impact on our city. Within the first 2 weeks of the shooting, city departments spent over $500,000 of unbudgeted dollars on police, fire, and sanitation overtime and other related expenses. We continue to deal with what we know will be a long-lasting and negative impact on the psychological well-being of survivors as well as children in our city. And Fred mentioned the trauma that many in the Black community are dealing with and have been dealing with for a very long period of time. Well, this shooting created trauma on top of trauma. And while, yes, the impacts were particularly deep on the Black community and Black children, we found in Buffalo that children of all backgrounds were frightened, impacted, and traumatized by this horrific shooting. We found children in every section of the city and parts of the suburbs that were afraid to go to school because of this racist attack, afraid to go out of their homes. So yes, the impact is deep on the Black community, but the impact of racism is painful and deep for all of us. Since May 14th, I've been helping to give voice to all those impacted by this senseless shooting, the victims, the survivors, and the community who are coping with the aftermath by participating in a variety of discussions at the local, state, and national level. These discussions have focused on public safety, sensible gun reform, social media, education, and yes, mental health. My administration has focused on how to address the impact of mental health issues in our community. One way we have done this is by creating an innovative partnership with Endeavor Health Services to embed psychologists with Buffalo police officers in the field, as well as at Buffalo Police Headquarters, called the Behavioral Health Team. This special team of officers underwent extensive training in mental health, which enabled them to work with the Endeavor clinicians and ensure the city can respond more effectively to calls involving individuals who, because of any kind of mental health crisis or distress, might pose a danger to themselves and others. The team has been a tremendous success. In 2022 alone, there have been over 1,000 calls for service without incident. When communities like Buffalo are impacted by acts of racism, like we were in May, there is a mental and emotional toll. Through this panel discussion, I am hopeful you will address the visceral potency of racism and the harmful effects that it has on mental health. As we learn from the past and strive for a more equitable future, we must never forget this tragic event. I thank you for inviting me to make opening remarks, and I appreciate all that you do as educators and staff members to make a difference in the lives of our communities and in the lives of our students. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor Brown. Without further delay, I am honored to introduce our expert panelists and begin this roundtable discussion. Let me begin with Dr. Norma L. Day-Vines. Dr. Day-Vines serves as Associate Dean for Diversity and Faculty Development in the School of Education at Johns Hopkins University and maintains a faculty appointment as Professor of Counseling and Educational Studies. She is the clinical research lead at Hurdle Health, the leading provider of culturally intentional digital mental health services. The telehealth company trains its therapists using a cultural competence curriculum developed by Dr. Day-Vines. Dr. Day-Vines' research agenda examines the importance of multiculturalism as an indispensable tool in the delivery of culturally competent counseling and educational services for clients and students from marginalized groups. Her scholarship has appeared in leading counseling journals such as the Journal of Counseling and Development, the Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development, and Professional School Counseling. Dr. Day-Vines has consulted with school districts across the country to address issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In 2019, she was awarded a presidential citation from the American Counseling Association in recognition for her scholarship on multiculturalism. Welcome, Dr. Day-Vines. Next, we have Dr. Pierluigi Mancini. Dr. Mancini has over 30 years of experience providing culturally and linguistically appropriate behavioral health treatment and prevention. In 1999, he founded Georgia's only Latino behavioral health agency designed to serve the immigrant population, delivering affordable and appropriate mental health, addiction treatment, and prevention services in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Dr. Mancini is a nationally and internationally renowned consultant advising at all levels of government. He recently led a project to train clinicians in Latin America who are taking care of over 4 million displaced Venezuelans in the region. Dr. Mancini serves as the chair-elect on the board of directors for Mental Health America National, an organization committed to anti-racism and the promotion of mental health as a critical part of overall wellness. Dr. Mancini also serves on the boards of the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse and Recovery Innovations International. Welcome, Dr. Mancini. Our next panelist, I am proud to say, is a fellow UUP member, Dr. Peter Martin. Dr. Martin is currently an assistant professor of psychiatry for the University at Buffalo. He is board certified in general child and adolescent and forensic psychiatry. He is the director for the Division of Community Psychiatry. He works in a variety of settings dealing with the intersection of psychiatry and the law. He provides treatment and conducts court-ordered evaluations in both the adult and youth correctional systems. Dr. Martin also participates in community-based organizations focusing on youth that have complex systems of care needs. Dr. Martin participates in the supervision and teaching of medical students, residents, and fellows, and is the director for the Forensic Psychiatry Fellowship Program. Dr. Martin completed his undergraduate education at UB, where he completed his general psychiatry residency while simultaneously participating in the American Psychiatric Association's Public Psychiatry Fellowship. Welcome, Dr. Martin. Finally, I'd like to introduce you to Karl Shallowhorn. Karl Shallowhorn has worked in the field of mental health for 21 years and is a New York State credentialed alcoholism and substance abuse counselor. He is the director of youth programs for the Mental Health Advocates of Western New York and the president and founder of his own consulting company. Mr. Shallowhorn draws on his personal experience to help others. He was a featured speaker for a TEDx Buffalo 2021, where he gave the talk, African American Men and Mental Health, Crisis or Opportunity, and was featured in the 2021 A&E Network documentary, Voices Magnified, Mental Health Crisis. Mr. Shallowhorn has received numerous awards for his mental health advocacy work, including from the National Federation for Just Communities and the Buffalo Association of Black Social Workers. He is the host of Mental Health Versus, which can be heard on 91.3 FM, WBNY Buffalo. Mr. Shallowhorn is a proud SUNY graduate, having earned his master's degree in Student Personnel Administration from Buffalo State. Welcome, Mr. Shallowhorn. The way the program will proceed is I will be posing a series of pre-selected questions to get the conversation started and allow our panelists to expound on their ideas, experiences, and research. My goal will be to open the floor at the end of the panelist discussion for questions or additional thoughts from all of you who have joined us today for this important conversation, as time allows. I do have to add that caveat. To begin, we are addressing some big and sometimes unwieldy topics today. Can our panelists begin by putting some working definitions or explanations on the table for the following, each of the following: structural racism, generational trauma, mental health equity, culturally competent and responsive mental health care delivery. I think, given the seating arrangements, Dr. Dave Vines, I would invite you to proceed first on this one.
I want to make sure I leave space for everybody. Most of my writing and research focuses on strategies for... Can you hear me now?
That's it.
Okay, most of my writing and research focuses on strategies for working more effectively with culturally and linguistically diverse clients. And so I want to talk a little bit about culturally competent and responsive mental health care. One of the things we know is that 30% of all counseling sessions end prematurely, and 50% of counseling sessions with minoritized clients. And
that microphone's not working. This one
so what I just said is that we know that 30% of all counseling sessions end prematurely, and 50% of counseling sessions with minoritized clients end prematurely. And a lot of that has to do with assumptions that people make, that access to care, the lack of what people historically have called cultural competence. We're moving away in counseling and psychology from the notion of cultural competence. Cultural competence is important, but I'm going to talk about multicultural orientation second. But when we think about cultural competence, it has to do with our awareness, knowledge, and skills, our awareness of our own attitudes and biases, and awareness of the socio-political issues that clients confront, knowledge in terms of the acquisition of factual information about different groups, and skills. How do we integrate and synthesize our awareness and knowledge? That's important, but when we think about cultural competence, it presumes that there's a finite body of information. It just presumes that there's an endpoint. It presumes that once you got it, you got it. But we know that culture is not static and it's ongoing. So many counselors and psychologists are moving towards this notion of multicultural orientation. And when we think about multicultural orientation, we're thinking more about how the counselor shows up, sort of your essence, your sense of cultural humility, the notion that you have a sense of curiosity about your client, the notion that you acknowledge the limitations. So a lot of times we come into counseling and we act like we are the end-all be-all, but a client sitting across from us knows that we probably don't know anything about their culture, and so we have to acknowledge that. Another part of a multicultural orientation is cultural opportunities. How do we seize opportunities to talk about the embeddedness of issues related to race, ethnicity, and culture in the client's presenting concerns? I've been teaching for 25 years at 3 different universities. And one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of times counselors will pivot away from issues related to race, ethnicity, and culture rather than lean into them. But people's problems are often inextricably bound to issues related to race, ethnicity, and culture. So how do we teach students to have these discussions? And then finally, cultural comfort. There's a body of research that talks about counselors sometimes and psychologists sometimes being ill at ease with clients. But part of working with minoritized clients is making them feel comfortable, making them feel a sense of belonging, not acting afraid. So connecting with clients is really important. And how we show up is important. So again, for that definition, cultural competence is important, that body of knowledge is important, but how we show up is even more important.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time of your day to be here today. It's an honor for me to be here. I want to tackle two of these, and one is not in here, but I'm going to add it to the last one. When we talk about culture, I want to add language. So instead of cultural competence, cultural responsiveness, for us to talk about cultural and linguistic, including the deaf community. Deaf and hard of hearing resources are scarce, and we're also not taking care of them. So my specialty is on immigrant and refugee communities and the linguistic barriers that exist in having bilingual clinicians or having organizations that can actually serve them or welcome them in a culturally appropriate way. It's difficult. But the one I wanted to focus on was the structural and institutional racism, because these are, to me, one of the biggest barriers and probably the easiest to fix. Because when we talk about that kind of racism, are pervasively and deeply embedded policies and procedures in systems and in organizations. And there's two ways that they're there. They were placed there on purpose, or they were placed there a long time ago and nobody's looked at them to revise them. But at the end of the day, we behave as an organization, as a system based on policy and procedures. You know, I applaud what the mayor said, that the police officers are getting extensive mental health training, but sending the police still criminalizes an illness, right? So we launched 988 in July, and there's still hundreds of thousands of people that don't know what 988 is, right? And it is the alternative. You call 988 for a mental health crisis or a suicide attempt or thought, and clinicians talk to you. If somebody needs to be dispatched, a clinician gets dispatched, right? So those barriers, structural and institutional, are the ones that need to be changed at the local, state, federal, and organizational level. Because that's where we're responding as to who we let into our organization, who we're able to serve, what kind of insurance or cash payment they have. And if they don't fit any of those, then they're out. And most of the time, who's out is Black and brown, right? So we have to be able to take those head on, and we have to be able to start changing those structural barriers that exist in our organizations.
It's working? All right. Maybe? So I feel very fancy now, holding it closer. So as I'm just trying to think about piggybacking and maximizing. All right, there we go. That's much better. I can talk loudly, but this is easier. So as I think about kind of where to springboard off of these concerns too, one of the things we wanted to also talk about in terms of thinking of definitions, how to talk about is generational trauma. And as a clinician, I think about trauma all the time. You know, there's this concept of trauma-informed care. The concept that if you don't think about trauma, you'll probably miss it if you're seeing someone. Sometimes people will bring it up and it's right in front of you. But a lot of times it's more subtle, or maybe there's you can think of it as the tip of the iceberg. There's the stuff that's right in front of you, and then you have the huge base of other types of traumas. And that definitely takes place as we're thinking about these greater structural and institutional type of concerns that lead to ongoing traumatic events. I think about it a lot when I'm working with folks, especially that happen to have some touching within the correctional system, and maybe even more so when working with kids in the juvenile justice system, where we're just talking about like a criminalization of a behavior. Yes, maybe they are doing things that are, quote, bad, but there's a lot of things that lead up to that. And if I think about, and if I'm training different folks, one of the things I will consistently say, and I probably seem like a broken record, is you have to think, what's the consistent theme of everyone in this place is trauma, by and large. Maybe it's not what we call like a big T trauma, where like maybe your life was threatened, that type of idea. But maybe there's multiple little T traumas over and over. You're in an impoverished neighborhood where you don't even necessarily have the funding for food, so you have to balance, do I eat well or do I keep the lights on, that type of idea, and how that goes on and on and on. There are these things that are considered adverse childhood events. And these are thought about a lot, especially in general primary care, working with kids, working with adults. And one of the consistent themes is that the more these adverse childhood events, or they're called ACEs, the more that people have these, it's a cumulative effect. And the more you have, the more you're at risk to have both mental and physical health issues, both as a youth and as an adult. And some of these things seem to be very obvious. You know, did you have a history of something like physical abuse, sexual abuse? So clearly a concern. Clearly, as we're talking about, some of these general factors will play into things. But then there's also these more subtle things. Have you ever had a family member that was incarcerated? And you know, so, I mean, this is something where I'm talking with someone, and this is where I'll talk about the elephant in the room. They will look at me and I'll say, I'm clearly maybe not the same background as you. That doesn't mean I can't at least understand some of the impact of things. And so, for instance, I haven't had anyone in my family that was incarcerated or whatever. How about you? And by and large, almost everyone's like, yeah, actually, not only it's so common, it's almost hard to get past sometimes. It's a normative thing. And what types of things got to that, got it so that the person was there in the first place. So you look at these other types of events that maybe aren't necessarily what everyone else would say trauma, and yet it is an impact. So I'll say on that.
I guess I'll address the other topic that was brought up, and that is mental health equity. Now, of course, you think about equity as far as equality, and they're not the same thing. So when I consider mental health equity, I think of the broader idea of health equity and how it affects communities of color. So, for instance, many times, and I know even myself included, I may even take it for granted what I have available in terms of access to health care. I have health insurance. I have a provider. I have supports to help me get what I need when I need it. There are many people in our communities that don't have the same kind of access for a lot of reasons. I think about medication. I take medication. I'm a person with lived experience with a mental condition. I take medication, but I have the things in place to be healthy. So we think about the inequity that exists in our communities. There are many disparities that people experience. So for instance, think about yourself. If you have to, say, make an appointment with a doctor, you probably already have a provider. You may have someone to go to address a condition you have. There are individuals in our communities that don't have something like this, or even if they do, they may be unable to afford to go. That's something that often isn't thought of. Even if there's insurance involved, there's co-pays. There's barriers in place that create inequities for people that get the help they need. And also, along with that, consider the fact that there are also other structures around equity that basically are barriers to care. So when you consider mental health itself, there's the idea of providers. So in other words, providers of color. I think it's something like 4%, and I'm just off the top of my head thinking, 4% of social workers in our country are people of color, psychologists. Like, in other words, there's such a huge disparity in the numbers of people of color that offer services that relates to the idea of cultural humility and understanding and competence, that for a person of color to go in and to see someone and to talk to someone that isn't like them, there's an equity. So how will I, as a person of color, go and speak to someone who I look at and I say, well, can you even relate to my experience? That's an equity. So there are a lot of things around this topic that often we don't even think of. And we were talking beforehand, before we began, and another way to look at it is just simply empathy. It's like a theme that for many people, they don't have this understanding or willingness to understand where the other person's coming from. If people were able to be more empathetic in their approach to just looking at the other person that's in front of them, I think a lot of these issues would be approached differently. So, from my perspective, both in my work, as a clinician, as a mental health advocate, as an educator, I always go back to empathy. That's one of the things we learn in our training, how to use empathy as a means of breaking down a lot of these barriers that keep us separated. So I think if we just simply did that, we'd be in a lot better shape.
Thank you all. I'm going to move us to a question that, well, relates to a lot of what has just been said, but it was especially emphasized by Dr. Martin, and that's trauma. As we have focused on May 14th, 158 days ago, white supremacists targeted the Eastside Buffalo community in an act of domestic terrorism. And it was white supremacy in action. The impact that it had, as the mayor mentioned, was not just in the Eastside community. It was not just in Buffalo. It was not just in the state of New York. It was national and indeed international. The question that I have, it is brief, but I believe it opens to the heart of the issue that we are examining. I invite all of the panelists to please speak to the short and long-term impacts of white supremacist violence. Violence, you can define it as you wish. From my definition, it is not just an act of physical aggression against another person. Okay. Violence on the mental health of individuals and communities who witness and experienced racialized violence near and or far.
Yes, I'm the microphone holder, so I'll go first. I guess when I think about violence, and I think importantly, it's not only that it could happen or that it is happening, but the threat that it could happen too, and just the idea of, if I leave my house, am I going to have something bad happen to me? Or if I am just walking down the street and something seems to be suspicious and someone is going to maybe look at me differently just based on my background, et cetera, versus me doing something different. How can that not impact someone on a day-to-day basis? And that's one of these things where when I think about it also, and again, I keep coming back to things clinically because that's what I do, but I think about it on a day-to-day basis and how the lived-in experience of folks is just sometimes so much drastically different than what I go through. One time I had a kid who lived relatively nearby from where I am, but his life we might as well have lived on Mars. And it was so different. And just, he said, you don't understand, you don't get it. When I walk out of the house, I have to worry about violence. I have to worry about things. And I say, I understand that, but, and he said, no, there's no buts about this. Like, it's just, you just don't get it. And it was just one of these great eye-opening moments of like, you're right, I don't get it. And we're just talking about having empathy, right? Empathy being the idea of trying to see the experience from the other person, not necessarily sympathy, which you feel, maybe even feel bad, et cetera, and both are important in their own way. But it was one of these great eye-opening experiences of realizing like there's a lot of different, either again, that they are exposed to the direct risk of violence, or there's the concern, it's sort of like the elephant in the room at all times, and how does that impact their behaviors? And again, a lot of times it's more than I even appreciate, so I try to think about it actively.
Thank you. So I think we're going to be fighting for the mic, such rich topics here. Anti-immigrant sentiment is one of the biggest issues that I face every day. In the Latino community, there is traumatic effects due to exclusionary immigration policies. There's also generational trauma caused by that. Now, anyone that's had to leave their country for whatever reason and immigrate to another country, everybody comes different ways. And in many of those, there is trauma associated with it, before, during, and after. That often goes undetected or untreated because we don't have the ability to do it. We don't have the infrastructure to do it yet. But studies are beginning to come out where anti-immigrant sentiments affecting children is really creating a lot of problems. So the multilingual clinic that was mentioned during my introduction, we had a prevention program for elementary school kids, and we had everybody, American kids and Latino kids, and we would provide alternatives, right? Because kids get bored, right? So we had soccer, we had dance, And in the dance program, there was a group of girls, and they were really good dancers, middle school. So they would be invited to big events to go and dance for an event or their state event. And one of those trips, we had a white van, and the girls were in the van, and we're going to a United Way building that had a nice space for events, and they were invited to dance there. And as we're pulling into the United Way building, there is a security guard in uniform, blue blazer, gray pants, and he's guiding the van to go into the garage. And one of the girls starts screaming, saying, "Immigration!" and throws herself on the floor of the van. And what's significant about this, she was a US-born third-generation Latina girl. And she had that reaction because of what goes on out there. So even though they may not be immigrant themselves, immigrant children or children born here to immigrant parents are facing some of these issues. Now, the political rhetoric also causes problems. A couple of years ago, the previous administration, it was no policy, it was just rumors that if you're an immigrant and you use social services, even if you're eligible, but if you use them, you're gonna lose your residency. You're gonna lose your citizenship. So what happened? Many immigrant families stopped taking their kids to the doctors. They stopped going for their care for whatever chronic condition they had. So, and the last thing I'll say about this, immigrants come all the time, and there is a process for citizenship. You go through residency, you go through citizenship. Well, the citizenship exam or the interview has a question about moral turpitude, and excess drinking is considered moral turpitude. So if you're a person in recovery from a substance use disorder, from an alcohol use disorder, and you're asked in the citizenship questionnaire if you've abused alcohol, you may not get to become a citizen, even if you're in recovery. So we have, going back to the structural institutional policies that we need to review to make sure that we're not hurting people, it becomes one of the most critical items.
Another issue around, we're talking about with traumas and so forth, is that of vicarious trauma. And that's an issue where you are basically experiencing someone else's trauma, or even called secondary trauma. So one thing that happens very much to communities of color is media. We have media in the room. We had a lot of media earlier. And when these stories are on, they just continue to keep these images ingrained in a person's mind, and it's sort of like you can't escape from it. Mind you, you can try to turn it off, but it's sort of like you can't escape it. I want to just get a show of hands. How many people here have social media? Okay, we got a pretty good number of people. So even through our social media, many times it's hard to get away from, unless you have a very narrow, group of friends, or if you have 5 friends. I'm not a little facetious, but it's true. It's hard to get away from all these things around us, because you may not have these issues, but you might have a friend who either I don't say friend, of course, Facebook friend, but you might have someone that says something, but it might be triggering. But think about it, once again, put yourself in the shoes of someone who is seeing these things, who has experienced these things either directly or is of the same ethnicity. Think about the many instances we've had over the years. When we see someone like George Floyd, think about George Floyd. How many times did we see Derek Chauvin with his knee on the neck of George Floyd? Repeatedly, over and over and over, to the point where many people, at least that I know, said, I can't take this anymore. So these images reinforce, you talk about white supremacy, it reinforces this idea that you're powerless, you have no power. And that's really what really white supremacy is all about, is power, and trying to say that we have power over those that are not like us. And of course, white supremacy has its roots. Certainly, you could go back centuries. And I think what happens now is that we have a state we're at, or a condition we have in this country where there's all this division, and it's kind of like a state rearing its ugly head. So even more so than ever, people that are of this mindset are empowered to come out, say these things, and would be through the media. We know there's media outlets. There's also other platforms, social media platforms that simply propagate these messages. So they're reinforced over and over and over. But what happens is those who are affected, those communities of color, are experiencing in a way that has never been before. It is simply something that we're in a whole new world. And so we have to find ways to address these issues. And it's sort of like, where do we begin? I mean, it's such a big thing. So, I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I know we need to have these conversations. And we also, and another thing I talked about before we began is we need to get to the place where we are able to have these conversations and understand that the systems that are in place are meant to separate us. In other words, you talk about systemic racism and so forth. A lot of these systems are designed to make us feel that we are more different than we are the same. And I think that's part of the problem. So until we're able to do that, we're not going to get anywhere.
I was just going to say that my teaching time is bought out by Hurdle Health, and on your desk you have a report that we conducted. This is our second year of the report, and it's following George Floyd. The first year we talked about the impact of mental health on African Americans. This year we talked about vicarious racism. We called it vicarious racism. It is vicarious trauma, but racism. When we think about racism, we as a people, we've got to stop thinking about racism as a generic term. We've got to look at it as it impacts different groups differentially. So when we look at, each minoritized group in this country, they've been impacted differently by racism and discrimination. So we look at Native Americans, we look at their connection to the land. We look at the pipelines that are being built through sacred property that has, sort of a disproportionate impact on them in ways that it doesn't impact other people. We look at the missing and murdered Native American women. We haven't had enough national conversation. When we look at Asian Americans, they are pitted as a model minority. And when you have a group that is a model minority, you make the assumption that every individual is perfect. I teach in a counseling program, and we have several Asian students. And one of the things they'll always say to me is, Dr. Devines, every time people look at me, they think that I'm supposed to be gifted in math and science. And I'm not gifted in math and science. There's a great book by Jamie Liu called Asian Americans in Class, and she looks at second generation Korean American individuals. And she looks at the different developmental trajectories that the children have as a result of their parents' occupations. If their parents were merchants and they owned their own businesses, they were able to give their children access to opportunities and resources. If they were employees, they worked 16, 18 hours a day, and they weren't able to provide resources and opportunities for their children. Because who's going to do homework when their parents at work? And nobody's there to monitor it. And Asian Americans have been targeted disproportionately in the pandemic. When we think about the Latinx community, or the Latino community, one of the things we think about is the issues around language. We think about the issues around immigration. When we think about African Americans, we think about state-sanctioned violence. So each group has its own cross to bear as it pertains to racism and discrimination. So that's and its relationship to white supremacy. When we think about this in a mental health context, there's a section in the paper that sort of deals with this. We need to go back historically. We have this impression in the United States that, once slavery ended, everybody was on the same playing field, but everybody was not on the same playing field. The pathways were very different. And when we look at it in the context of mental health, we have to go back to psychiatry. And we have a section in there that talks about early psychiatry. Doctors early on, during the antebellum period, did not have a lot of credibility the way they do now. they weren't saving lives. And so one of the things they did is they staked their reputations around slave medicine. So they came up with these made-up diseases: drapetomania, runaway slave disease, cachexia africanus, dirt-eating diseases. And you treat runaway slave disease by, being brutal. And when we think about early psychiatric facilities in the Deep South during the antebellum period, there was differential treatment. People were scientists were very committed to determining a racial hierarchy with groups in the same way that Karl Linnaeus focused on plants and animals. He later focused on the racial hierarchy, because if you create a racial hierarchy, then you can justify any kind of mistreatment, because the people at the bottom are seen as non-human. And so when you go back to these early psychiatric facilities, one of the things you'll see that Black and white patients had similar kinds of diagnoses, but they were treated very differently. Whites needed idyllic conditions to heal. They needed to have music and arts and books. But guess what Black people were thought to need to heal? Huh? Oh, yeah, please say it. Please say it. Pretty much occupational therapy, so that they can assume their position, sort of later on. And it doesn't end there. After slavery, then we see the eugenics movement, where the testing goes on, and then we decide who is normal and who's not normal, and who's worthy of reproducing. And it sounds similar to what's going on right now. Who's worthy of reproducing and who's worthy of not reproducing. And then when we move up to the civil rights movement, we think about all of the Black men that were corralled in mental health facilities or psychiatric facilities because they were protesting their civil rights. So when we think about white supremacy, it has deep roots, and we can draw a straight line from the past to the present. And one of the things we need to do is think about how we are going to dismantle these systems of oppression that still have their grips around every group in this country, even though the way the grip is, it looks different from group to group.
Thank you very much. The third question that I'm going to give you to discuss, actually, you have just taken us partially down that road in your answer. And that is, what would you establish as the preeminent structural, historical, and present-day barriers to the provision of mental health care in minoritized communities? And what is at stake if we do not address these barriers?
Okay, since I'm holding the microphone.
Yeah.
I think we have to start with ourselves. We have to acknowledge that unless we do the work that we need to do to address any kind of implicit bias, any kind of prejudice that we have, which we all have. We all have prejudice. We're all sensitive to discrimination because we're a product of where we grew up and by whom we were raised. So we are acting out, and unless someone tells us that there's something wrong with that, we're gonna keep doing the same things, right? But once I know, so if I'm in a room and somebody says something inappropriate or racist, right? And I approach that person and I truly feel, boy, they really did not know. And I know that can happen because I've met adult white men who never saw a Black person till they went to college, right? So that still exists in this country. But once they know, then there is no excuse. Then it's their responsibility to act different, to behave different. And when I attend these forums or whatever other workshop or book that I read, and I learn the truth, I learn the history, then I can no longer stay silent. Then it's my obligation to speak up whenever I'm in a place and something gets said that's not correct, that's inappropriate, or that is racist. So if we don't address these issues, because usually we continue to repeat this behavior, right? We have a horrible tragedy and all this attention goes to it. but then the policy and procedures never change. So things will go back to the way they were going. So unless we do that, and the only way we can do that is by standing up every time we're in a meeting and says, this is not correct. We need to change this, right? And we can do that collectively. So when we look at, racialized oppression on health, and health, physicians, psychiatrists, they were part of the problem. Diagnoses were made based on your race, your ethnicity. They were making up diagnoses just to make sure that that person was not going to be able to move forward. So if we don't act on this, it's going to continue to happen. And who's going to be hurting? The communities that are not getting the help now. We're going to continue to see the health disparities. We're going to continue to see Black and brown people die younger and have worse health problems than the rest of the country.
And when I think about a lot of these system-based barriers, we're trying, and the focus, this is on mental health in particular, and there's definitely things within the mental health system that can be done to improve things. But also, it's sort of at the detriment if that's the primary focus and not looking at some of the things we also are talking about, because there's so many different systems that do directly impact mental health, especially for minorities of color. So when you look at things like, and this is where you can't ignore the historical aspects, when you look at banking, for instance, and differential for loans for different populations. This is a great example where I remember the first time I heard about that, I said, that can't be true. Like that's impossible. And then you find out, oh, it is. And by the way, this wasn't that long ago. I'm like, oh, I'm not that old, but that's a challenge, right? So, so you have, those very real aspects. I mean, we can go back from antebellum period to moving forward. You have different laws that look at things differently. And you look at voting rights and voting districts and how those are set up and gerrymandering and all that impacts in terms of some of these larger structural concerns. You look at other things too in terms of, we've hinted at this as well, but differential rates for incarceration, for how different things are impacted. And there's lots of arguments about why that might be, but you can't ignore the fact that when you just look in those facilities, is definitely primarily filled with individuals that are people of color, right? And so, and then again, I work in these institutions, and so when I look around, this isn't just pie in the sky, this is definitely every single day. You look at other aspects too, looking at from our educational system and how things are done. You look at how the educational system will deal with different types of behaviors, and also how this, unfortunately, will be more likely to negatively impact minority populations. So this, Johnny or Jane did X, Y, and Z, we're going to suspend or expel them, versus, oh, well, they were having a bad day, and how that impacts. And if you can't even have that educational foundation, how will you then be able to move forward in society and then be able to be the person that you want to be for the next generation, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot of these different sort of major systems that go into place, and we've hinted as well in terms of access to things like either good quality, just general healthcare, or access to things like food. You have food deserts, et cetera, where folks can't even if they want to be healthy, they can't be because it's not safe, or there's not supermarkets around, et cetera. So these are these major systems that if we only focus on one or two things, we won't be able to really move the dial to where we want to be. And then also, like we're doing here, advocacy and having people, you're mentioning, just if you're in the room, but you have to actually speak up and not to be complacent to things.
So those are really, really salient points. And I want to just talk about what's at stake. Of course, there's where we are now, but what about the future? And in my role, I'm the director of youth programs. I work with a team of youth peer advocates who go into the schools. They offer presentations about mental health. They run skill building groups. They do one-on-one peer mentoring. They are all young people between the ages of 18 and 26. At least my team is. To be youth peer advocate, you can be between the age of 18 and 30. But they are able to sort of meet the students and the youth where they're at. They work with students anywhere from ages 9 through, well, we have even, we call it 20-something support group, basically. But they work with people that are peers. We say peers, like similar to their age. So I think about, from that context, the future. So that's really what's at stake for me in my world. I think about how so many youth are struggling. I mean, we hear about the prison to school to prison pipeline. That is yet another example of what is in place and what's facing many of our youth today. So I think we also have to consider how we take that into effect. So when I think about the idea of where we're going, I'm really concerned. We're already dealing with an issue of the pandemic, how it has affected youth in terms of their education, how it has affected the ability to learn, how it affects their social connections. I mean, the last 2.5 years have greatly stunted and arrested their development in all kinds of ways. And I mean, I will say I'm the father of 2 adult daughters. And all I know is that if I had to go through what many people have gone through the last 2.5 years with my daughters, I'd be probably thinking things more intensely because of what I've seen with those with whom I work. So I think about those consequences, about the youth of today and what they're facing. The idea of, once again, access to care, the idea of how poverty affects youth, how access to education, how access to healthcare, all these things we're talking about, but specifically with our young people, because that is the future. And unless we start doing these things like changing policies and changing the way that we're doing things, our future is at peril.
About earlier, several years ago, I wrote several articles on suicide in the African American community because the rates had spiked. And I would go to conferences and I would ask the presenter, well, could you talk a little bit about the correlates of suicide in the African American community? And people had no idea, like they didn't know. It's a travesty when we think about the fact that the demographic composition is changing, that within the next 10 to 20 years, ethnic minorities will constitute a numerical majority. And how can you not know some of these issues, how suicide impacts different groups differentially? The African American community, suicide is considered taboo, and suicide is underreported in the African American community because if you are connected culturally, you're going to do what you have in your mind to do, but you're going to do it in ways that don't violate cultural norms. So when we think about suicide by cop, or we think about engaging in self-injurious lethal behavior, that may be more acceptable than, say, putting sort of a gun to your head or your mouth. So sort of understanding, sort of what different issues look like. Issues look like within communities is important. Legislation is important, and everybody in here can do something, say something, petition our legislators. One of the things I would say, if you haven't already read it, Cheryl Cashin has a good book called Black Hood, White Space, and in it she talks about resource hoarding. And when you look at communities all across the country, you can see where there's a pocket that is segregated, that gets absolutely no resource, same funding streams, but gets absolutely no resources. And that's resource hoarding because you have a dominant group that is getting the best transportation system, the best water, the best, sort of access to every resource, but minoritized groups are not. And we can name cities all over the country. Larry Brown wrote a book called The Black Butterfly. I work in Baltimore, and Baltimore, there's East Baltimore, West Baltimore, and then there's right down Charles Street is where the affluent people live. All of the resources go there. Same city, same funding stream, all of the resources go there. Our governor was supposed to be putting a transportation system so that people, primarily minority individuals, could get to and from work. A 15-minute drive to work takes 45 minutes. Scholars call that transportation detention. I mean, so, how does that impact getting to and from work if you have to take 3 or 4 buses to get there? The same thing with students because we don't have a public bus system, a public transportation, school bus system, sort of in Baltimore. But
I'm going to pose the final question that is on our pre-selected list of you first, which is, as you were just discussing, what do you see as concrete legislative policies that need to be pursued in order to address specifically the mental health inequities as you see it?
So some of it we see already happening, but legislation that would provide training, specific training in minoritized communities to work with specific issues around minoritized individuals. So it's definitely the legislation for resources and funding to eliminate health, to eliminate mental health care. And then the Mental Health Parity Act, we should be reimbursing physical health and mental health similarly.
The one actionable step that any state can implement right now is in their licensing procedures. They vary by every state. In Georgia, for example, if you're licensed in Florida, Georgia won't give you reciprocity. But if you're licensed in Alabama, they will. Makes no sense. Well, there is this need for clinicians. Before the pandemic, we had 250,000 clinician shortage. That number has tripled. We need clinicians. If you speak another language, or if you have limited English proficiency, there is even less clinicians available. But we do have foreign-born professionals in this country that we do not allow to work as clinicians because of those same policies and procedures that the licensing boards have. For example, in some countries, an internship is not required. But here, if you don't have an internship, your application is not moving forward. So they're asking foreign-born professionals to go back and get a master's degree here, which can be cost prohibitive or time prohibitive. But if we're able to identify these clinicians and have
in terms of if you're thinking like basically from the womb, how do you improve parenting skills for especially when you know that there's going to be certain populations that are going to be more at risk for various type of traumas? And there's been research and different types of programs on this for decades, but again, funding. So this is where the legislation part comes in, funding for those programs. Prevention's not very sexy. We don't want to really necessarily pay for something you're going to see the result 10, 15, 20 years down the line, and yet that's where you not only get good bang for your buck, but it's also a good place to start with things. So that's from a more of a population standpoint. At least within, how can we maybe improve the mental health for folks that are disproportionately affected, and also be able to have them have more access to individuals that are either more like them or can have some of that shared lived-in experience. You can start with things, and all these types of things have been done to varying degrees, and maybe again legislatively is trying to think of how to coordinate this and standardize it, where you start from grade school on up, and so you have it so that kids start to have more curricula in terms of learning about mental health, just emotional awareness, self-soothing type of things, risk for substance use disorders and how to prevent it, helping empower, and just make it standardized. Again, sort of like everyone's health class that is plus minus how good those can be sometimes, right? But at least if you have as the concept that it's treated as equal as anything else and as important as any other type of information, then that can be useful. And then as you keep going on up, so you have to also create some level of incentive for folks to even want to go into a mental health field. So that's where you get them young. So you try to incentivize and create programs, whether it's a mentorship type of program or at least exposure for high school kids that might not even be able to necessarily complete school, let alone go on further in school. So how do you create that type of programming? And then once you start to get to the collegiate type of environment for the folks that, again, might be able to have more knowledge or understanding these type of things, you give them even more information in terms of culture. I love the discussion earlier about cultural competence and how that really, this term we use a lot, and yet it really just kind of gives a checkpoint of, okay, I'm competent, I'm good enough, right? As opposed to it's much more complicated than that, but at least an awareness of these type of things. And then you also, even from the college and on up level, from master level programs, PhD programs, medical school programs, how do you actively recruit individuals that come from different backgrounds so that it's not as primarily white in terms of that. And that's where, like locally at UB with the medical school, they've done an active push to try to increase disproportionate and underrepresented individuals, and the numbers are pretty impressive even over a couple years. When you actively seek that type of population, how you can actually improve recruitment, and you get an entire different set of individuals with different life experiences, and it gets a much more culturally diverse background. So these are at least some of my broad thoughts on it.
I could just piggyback on what Dr. Marvin was talking about when it comes to education. I'm on the board for the Mental Health Association of New York State, and in 2017, we were the organization that got legislation passed in the New York State Assembly and Senate to have the first mental health education law in all of the United States. In other words, it was legislated that all schools, pre-K through 12, or K through 12, public schools, have to have mental health education in the curriculum. So it was worked through in collaboration with New York State Ed, and now all school districts throughout the state have to have mental health education. It is really based on the district. They're autonomous in how they make these decisions, but we've come such a long way. Now there's other states as well, I think Virginia and many others who followed suit. And that's a place to begin. I think when you talk about education and you talk about mental health, we have to teach and teach young and teach what it means to have a mental health condition, but also what to do if you have a mental health condition. One of the things that's great that we have where I work, it's a program called Just Tell One. And Just Tell One is designed to help young people between the ages of 12 and 26 understand how to talk to a trusted adult if they find they're struggling with depression, anxiety, suicide, substance use. And so we offer this program, and it's a way to, once again, educate young people. So it's through these programs, through these legislative programs that we push this out. In addition to that, there's also a program called Mental Health First Aid. So Mental First Aid is a program that's sponsored through the National Council for Mental Wellbeing. I've been an instructor since 2014. There's a variety of curricula. There's an adult curricula, there's their curriculum, there's a youth curriculum. And these programs are for adults, specifically for the youth program, that work with youth, whether it be in schools or other programs. And the beautiful thing is that it teaches things at a level that anybody can learn this program. You don't have to be a clinician. But what it does is it teaches about signs and symptoms of mental illness. It raises awareness, addresses stigma, and there's even a cultural component that was added on in the second edition. So it also addresses the cultural piece. So really, from my world, once again, it's a lot about education, about just teaching as early as we can at a developmentally appropriate age so that this next generation is more aware. In fact, I will say, based on the conversations I've had with my team of peer advocates and even my own daughters, our youth are more aware of what mental health is, and they know really more about what these things are, certainly more than when I was their age. And I think this does actually give me a glimmer of hope for the future. But we still need to do more. There's still more room to grow. There's still stigma, and stigma is a major barrier. We talk about barriers. That is a significant barrier still in what we're dealing with in terms of all these things. So we need to also address the stigma that exists to make things better for everybody.
Thank you very much. We do have time for one, perhaps two questions. If anyone in the audience would like to ask one, we've got a question. I think, yeah. Yeah, we're live streaming and recording.
Hello? Okay, it works. So I've been looking at the UUP resources here. I've been reading your research profile of information. I am from Buffalo, impacted by 514, a lot of other things. And when I looked at this roundtable in terms of what you're talking about, you're looking at structural racism, generational trauma, and the implications of mental health equity. Now I'm going to put the elephant in the room and take it a step further. What are your beliefs of the implications in the workplace environment? Because we are UUP. I feel a lot of people are here because we've either seen or experienced things through the past couple of years in our SUNY work environments that have triggered off things for us. And the hope is hearing from this panel about what suggestions would you have for the SUNY system in addressing what is happening in the workplace environment as it relates to structural racism. as it relates to generational trauma, as it relates to implications for mental health equity. Because I go back to a quote that I wrote down here at the beginning of this process, where it was mentioned that SUNY is positioned to do so. They're positioned to do so. But in being positioned, what's lacking is the will. So I would love to hear from each member of the panel as to what your feedback would be to us who visually see this on a daily basis or experience it on a daily basis. Because that's part of the reason why I know I came today, and I'm probably speaking for others, and if I am, you're welcome. And if I'm not, I apologize. But please talk to us about that, because that's what's impacting us personally right now.
I don't work in the SUNY system, but I am a university professor, and I'm also the Associate Dean for Diversity and Faculty Development, and our office was created 3 years ago, and the first thing I did was to hire a consulting company to come in and gather information about what is going on. They've done interviews, focus group sessions, and they're giving us surveys, document reviews, so that people can come by confidentially and talk about issues around racism, issues around vicarious racism, because in the workplace, people are impacted sort of negatively by not just what happens to them, but what they see happening to their peers. And so when they're done, well, they'll be done next month, we'll have a strategic plan that will help us. And we've also are looking at our policies and procedures. How are our policies negatively impacting students, faculty, and staff? Because it's not just being nice or having some training, but it is about looking at the policies that negatively impact others.
I'm glad for the question, only in that the one thing I sort of was like one of those aha moments of we should probably ask the folks that are involved, because if I'm yet another person that says this is what you need, that might be great, or it might be alienating, or it might be disincentivizing, etc. So I mean, it almost seems like a little bit of a semi-cop-out answer, but it's not supposed to be. But just piggybacking off of what was said, I don't have a great answer to that, only because I don't know the problem well enough to. But I think if it's a problem that you and I'm sure others have experienced, then that's an issue. So we need to address it. We need more information before we can meaningfully address it.
So, and I want to thank you for that question, because as you say, call it the elephant in the room, but what you're talking about exists, I think, across many industries, not just higher education. You're talking corporations across the United States. And whether it be, of course, we know terms like microaggressions and bias, and these are things that have existed for a long time, but I think now more than ever, they're coming to light. And it's through, I guess you could say, it has to be, at least in my mind, a top-down approach. If you don't get the buy-in from the higher up, then it's not going to go anywhere. Because I worked in higher ed for 12 years. I worked at Genesee Community College. I worked at Buffalo State for 6 years, and I worked at Damon. It's now Damon University. So I know even higher education, there's a hierarchy, there's a tier-based system, and oftentimes, things will come down from above, and and they call it the White Tower or whatever. But I think it has to be at a place where the administration needs to make sure that these things are put into place and delegate to whoever the appropriate personnel are on campus. Now, of course, diversity officers are very common these days on campuses, in many campuses across the country. But what is happening? What are they doing? I mean, are they just there as figureheads, or they're just there as just because it's nice to have one? Or are they actually putting actual programming into place? So I think what we're looking at is being able to take what's needed and make it actionable. and the university. She's going to retire. I'm happy for that. But she works in organizational development training. So I do know that she's done like safe zone training, and she's done other training that hopefully will get through and educate individuals that otherwise would not be exposed to this kind of education. And I'll say this last thing. Sometimes these programs are mandatory, and sometimes they're voluntary, right? So what's it gonna be? And I think sometimes we need to just say, whether it be through incentivizing or finding ways to get the message across, because sometimes, I don't know about you, but when I'm told I gotta do something, I might put up some resistance. But when I'm presented something that says there's value, I'm gonna get something out of it, then maybe I'll look at it a little bit differently. So we have to maybe take I guess it's, let's say, the honey versus vinegar approach, if you know what I mean? Like in terms of how we present these things. So I think there's ways we have to be creative in terms of how we do this, but it is possible. But it also, you're talking about changing systems that are in place, like everything else we're saying, that have been institutionalized for quite a while.
I also thank you for your question, because in a work environment, the top-down approach is not only the people on the top being part of the solution, but who's at the top? So what we usually have when it comes to corporate America is you have all these movements to bring in diversity at the boots on the ground level. But then there is no promotion. And the few that may get promoted, then there is no support. There is no retention, right? So it needs to be, once again, a purposeful approach to, are you developing a workforce that is going to have a seat at the table, that is going to have a voice as to how do we develop a mental health support program for employees? Or are you just going to check that, okay, we have 8% are African American, 3% are Latino, and then we're good, right? I'll take it even a step further back. Governance. Who are your board of directors? Who's your board of governors? And what is their diversity? And when you go hire individuals, because we all want to hire diversity, I'll take it a step back. Who wrote the job description? Because job descriptions can be written in a way that leave people out. And then who reads those resumes? Because we know resumes get turned away because the name doesn't sound white enough or American enough, right? So we have to be purposeful about those issues of how we're going to do that. Now, overall, in works in corporate America, mental health care has kind of gotten a little more attention, and DEI committees have been created everywhere, but very few places actually make it effective. So there's a lot of DEI committees, but they can't do anything. They're not allowed to do anything. And then when you ask for safe spaces where people can actually raise their hand and say, hey, you know what, we need this, they have fear of repercussions. So, yeah, I need my job. I'm not gonna rock the boat, right? So we need to provide safe spaces, but true safe spaces where people can speak up and have the ability to make changes that are gonna help things move forward. If not, we'll keep having these conversations every year.
I think that's an excellent place for us to close. I want to say one thing related to your question. I'm joined today by two of my fellow statewide officers, our Vice President for Professionals, Carolyn Kuby, and our Vice President for Academics, Alyssa Karl. Alyssa comes from Brockport, and Carolyn from Stony Brook Hospital. In the past 6 months, 8 months, in our conversations amongst the officer corps, we have emphasized the fact that whatever we do in terms of our work to address as an institution, as a union, racism in our society, we have to be damn sure that we are a legitimate voice, which means we are undertaking a program, thanks to Carolyn's hard work in getting us a grant and putting together a program that brings in an outside firm that specializes in this work, that we will be undertaking training for our own members as members of this union so that we can come to terms with our own racism and the racism of the institution in which we work. And to confront that, this is a long-term project. It will not be done in 6 months, a year. In fact, as I continuously say, it has no end. It is better to think of it that way, that this is ongoing work and it is a major priority and it will stay as a major priority for this union. And I hear your concerns, and they are absolutely front and center. We must insist on addressing these issues internally as well as raising them in our university and in our greater society. I would like to ask the panel a one-word answer question, maybe 2 words if you want to throw an adjective in. That is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future in terms of our society in dealing with the core issues that we have addressed today, which when it comes right down to it, yes, is racism and white supremacy. Dr. Devines, I'll start with you as we started with you to begin with.
I would say that I'm both hopeful and ambivalent.
I'm the eternal optimist.
Realistically optimistic.
Dr. Mancini stole my thunder. Eternal optimist.
I would like us all to acknowledge the brilliant panel that we have spent the last couple hours with. So thank you all very much for joining us. And before we close, I would like to ask the UUP staff that has worked for 5 months to put this together and has done an exceptional job. Please, all of you who are staff, stand so we can recognize your work. Thank you very much. I will close where I began, and that is that the work of justice needs doing, and it needs doing now. So I invite all of you to join us, to work with us, to make our state and our nation a more humane place to live